Um, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is João Rodrigues, or the very long version that you heard in the beginning. The title of my talk today is Slavery, State Formation, and Citizenship, a comparative analysis of the United States and Brazil. Before getting to the talk itself, I want to kind of like walk you through how I got to this type of investigation. So, I'm Brazilian, and in Brazil I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer, and I was working at an NGO as a volunteer with refugees, and I worked there for a year. And there I could tell that the majority of the population that came to seek asylum and asked to become a refugee were people of color. So that kind of made me think about like, what is it about race and citizenship that might have some sort of a connection, right? When we think about refugees, we have that idea of a boat reaching the shores of Europe and the idea of the crisis. But actually that's not one, an accurate fact, and two, the idea of a boat with colored people being forcibly displaced from one place to the other is not new. It has historical roots. What I'm showing, the idea that it's not real is that you can see that the 85% of refugees are hosted by developing countries. It's not Europe. And today you have over 25 million of them around the world. So that kind of thing makes me think about like, what is the relationship of race and citizenship? So I pick up on Dorothy Roberts, Penn professor, idea of race as a political system. She says that like citizenship, race is a political system that governs people by sorting them into social groupings. I want to advance that idea and not only say that race, like citizenship, is a political system, but I also want to say that citizenship itself is a racialized construct, and we can trace that historically. Just for the background, and we kind of go back to the idea of the boat with refugees. That's not new, right? So you have, there's a slave ship that went to the Americas, and just for the background from my talk, you can see that throughout the entire transatlantic slave trade, roughly 400,000 enslaved people were brought forcibly to the United States, which makes up a little bit less than 4% of the entire slave trade. And to Brazil, between 4 and 5 million enslaved people were brought to the country. So this is important to understand how the fluxes happen, and this is important to understand the historical process that I'm trying to talk about. So then we get to my research question. I'm trying to empirically understand how the legal system of slave societies, and here namely Brazil and the United States, deal with the right to migrate, and I'm here focusing on movement, right, across their populations. But the takeaway that I want you guys to have from this talk is that citizenship not only is a racialized concept, and specifically the right to movement as a part of citizenship is a racialized right. And by racialized, I mean that having access to resources and rights is related to your to the racial identity that you're a part of. So there's one thing interesting in the literature. When we're talking about state formation, the history of state formation, there's a hard focus on class, on how the class differentials lead to revolutions or some other forms of processes that lead to what we understand as the state. So, but there's an astounding silence when it comes to the processes of, when it comes to slavery and race and the process of racialization. And I wonder, how is it possible that slavery, an institute that has taken place for centuries in so many countries, not be taken into consideration when we're talking about the history of state formation? So, as for my methods and data, I'll do a comparative historical methodology, and I'm using archival data, as you can see here. In the next 2 slides, I'll show you pieces of evidence about examples of Brazil and the United States that demonstrate how the idea of movement as a part of citizenship is a racialized category, right? Here in Brazil, we have the Bill of Land, and it's basically a pathway to citizenship for white Europeans. What this piece of legislation is trying to say is that the foreigners that purchase land, and here foreigners as a proxy for white Europeans, can grant you the possibility of being naturalized, thus becoming a citizen, being a part of the political membership. So we have a racial identity of white Europeans that can come over to the country and not being born or anything, but be a part of the political community. The two pieces of legislation do not expressly mention race, but the intended consequences of those pieces of legislation are catered to groups and racial, depending on their racial identities. This is a way of racing populations without necessarily naming race or slavery. This is a phenomenon that happens for both Brazil and the United States, in which constitutions don't mention slavery, but they are regulating it oftentimes. Here, for the United States, we have that territorial displacement for enslaved people is actually connected to labor, but is not a right of citizenship. What we have here, what this piece of legislation is trying to say, is that if an enslaved person runs away from one plantation and goes to a state where slavery is legal, the master has the right to then go to that other state, seize the enslaved person, and bring back to the plantation where service labor was due. So you have here that person is a proxy for an enslaved person, which is an example of when the legislation does not race explicitly, but is intended to a specific racial group. And here we have the context of having the right to movement from a different region to the globe, that for white Europeans is a right, and here for enslaved person, it's not a right to move even within the same country, the territory of the same country. So the right to move across the territory is a racialized one. So this is basically the takeaway that I want you guys to have, that is connected to the idea of citizenship as a raced construct. So as for my conclusion, we have here that once race is a political system, and building off of that, citizenship is a racialized construct. And I hope that you were convinced by now that the idea of movement as one particular aspect of citizenship is also a racialized one. And why am I interested in this is not only because I have a historical curiosity on how those processes took place, but it's rather because I do believe that understanding and unpacking the historical process through which a state was formed and citizenship is what it is today, we can better understand current issues. And we go back to the beginning of the talk when I mentioned the refugees and the large amount of displaced people that we have in the world today. And it's not only understanding how citizenship and the access to rights and resources and how we can move across the places, we can understand current issues of refugees, stateless people, but even documented in so many other categories that stay outside of our understanding of who belongs to the political community. Thank you very much.